good to be with all of you. And I thought, today what I would do is just tell you kind of a little bit about where I've arrived at in the past year or so, in terms of my thinking about what's needed from faith communities and churches today in addressing the climate crisis. But I really am very interested in hearing your ideas. And so I'll probably end by throwing out some questions about things that I'm wrestling with. And I would really like to get your thoughts on how you perhaps wrestle with similar things or have opinions on them. But to set kind of the theme for my thoughts, I'll begin with the prophet Isaiah, because in a nutshell, where I've arrived at is I think the number one thing needed, I'm speaking out of the Christian tradition, so thinking about churches is to take a prophetic role today. And I'll talk more about what I mean by that, but I feel like that's part of what's largely missing in a way. And so to kind of set things off, I'll begin with the prophet Isaiah. There's a couple of little known facts about Isaiah. The first is that he was married to a prophetess. A lot of people don't know that. And so I think both Isaiah and we don't know her name, but and his wife had a lot of courage, in particular because of one segment of Isaiah's ministry, where we learn that for 3 years he walked around barefoot and naked as a form of protest and warning against the rulers of his time. And so I figure it must have taken a lot of courage to stay married to Isaiah, for sure during that time. But I use Isaiah to say that it's an example of public action, which to me is an important part of being a prophet. And it's also to set the theme that prophets bring before us what we might call naked truths that we must confront. And so I want to talk about what I think are some of the naked truths that prophets have kind of caused me to confront in reflecting upon our climate crisis today. And so some of the truths may seem kind of simple at first, but I think when you dig into it, there's a lot there with what prophets have to teach us. And so one thing I would take a look at is beginning with the kind of often considered kind of the granddaddy of the prophets, Moses. A lesson that we might take from Moses is just that being a prophet is about confronting the powerful with a demand, right? And so when, if there wasn't the famous phrase, "Let my people go," Moses would still be tending Jethro's flocks, right? And we would never have heard of him if he hadn't received the call to go confront Pharaoh. And I think that's an important lesson for the environmental movement as a whole, in a way, because we can all live a morally pure life tending to sheep, right? But the real challenge comes when it's applying one's morals to those who are on the throne, right? And so I think that to me is the thrust that is often needed. We can focus on lifestyle changes and other things, but ultimately we need to apply our morals to those who are in power, because that's ultimately what will make the difference in addressing something the size of the climate crisis. A second lesson to be learned, if you go to the prophet Jeremiah and the prophet Amos, is the importance of going public. So Jeremiah was called to be a prophet as a youth. He was called to be a prophet to the nations. He was called to pull down and overthrow kingdoms. And so in doing so, his task as it was given to him was to make his denunciations of the rulers in the hearing of all of Jerusalem. And so by nature, you're seeing this example of public action. And to me, public action is, if people were to ask me my theory of change, or I like to say my method for change, is that public action changes public attitudes, and public attitudes change voting behavior and policies. And we've seen this from the Civil Rights Movement to the Tea Party movement, that history shows us that that's what public action can do. And I think that's what's needed today, and the prophet's role model for that. And just last night, Reverend William Barber was here in Cleveland, and he shared his interpretation of the prophet Amos. And what he said is, if you look in the end of chapter 5, there's the famous line where Amos talks about, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And he said, for years I just focused on that. But then I looked at, how did he get to that point? And if you look a little earlier in that chapter, you learn how he got to that point. And God says to Amos that there will be wailing in all the streets and cries of anguish in every public square. And then Barbara proceeded to go on a riff about why we need public action today. So I think both Amos and Jeremiah are good examples of taking things to the public square. Then kind of one just final lesson I'll kind of say from some specific prophets before kind of moving to some contemporary naked truths as I see them, is the prophet Mary. Now, that might be, for Protestants, this might seem strange to call Mary a prophet, but there's a lot of good Catholic scholarship that discusses Mary as a prophet. Since Protestant, I think I would trust a Catholic any day over a Protestant when it comes to talking about Mount Mary. But I think one of the things that we know from Mary's Magnificat is just, one of the most revolutionary passages in the Bible about bringing the powerful down from their thrones and lifting up the lowly. And what she is really giving voice to is the kind of justice that rises as the people rise. And that points to me today with the climate crisis, making justice central to what we do. The leading environmental justice scholar, Robert Bullard, once put it very nicely when he talked about, succinctly, he talked about the climate crisis as an apartheid system of global decision-making. And he talked about how equity has to be at center stage, because people who have contributed the least to climate change, global warming, are the ones who feel it first, worst, and longest. And so justice can't be a footnote. It has to be at the center of everything we do. And so those are some of the things I kind of gather from the prophets. And as I said, to me, what's made it compelling today is just, I think, a naked truth today is that, the climate crisis is not, you can understand it as a science problem. That's good. But I think where sometimes we fall short is understanding it as both a social change problem, and then when you get into the social change problem, then it becomes a spiritual problem, I think. But basically what I mean by that is that, the government and Exxon, they've known for like 50 years about the climate crisis. People in power don't get scared straight by having an awakening about the climate crisis. And so that makes you realize what we're dealing with is really a social change problem. And to address the climate crisis on the scale of the problem, if you work your way back from the problem, to me, that means you have to think about what institutions can operate at that scale. And, for me, Bill McKibben, when he spoke in reference to an event we did, it was basically saying that's what's compelling about the Green New Deal, is it operates on the scale of the crisis, right? And so when you think about just the narrow timeline that we have to emphasize individual actions, it's like bringing a garden hose to fight a forest fire. Like we wouldn't, if somebody was doing that, we'd say, we would have no problem telling them that that's not the right thing to do. And what we say, well, this is a time for calling the fire department, right? And in this metaphor, the fire department is Congress, because it has the power to act on the scale. And so to me, that's really what it comes down to. If we want to talk about real solutions that operate on the scale of what we're dealing with, you have to talk about Congress, which I think is the most powerful institution in the world to address the climate crisis. I'd say that over the UN or any, or other governments. But and so that to me is why the climate movement, the naked truth is we really have to zero in and focus on it. And for me, it was difficult to see how things have gone with Build Back Better. To me, I don't get upset with politicians if they don't vote the way I want them to. In a way, I mean, it's disappointing that I knock on their door or whatever. But I think, to me, it shows just where the climate movement is at. If we had the strength and power necessary as a movement, then that legislation would pass. But the reality is that we don't have the strength and power as a movement to inflict the kind of social cost that would be necessary to compel a person like Manchin to vote, or Sinema. We just don't have that power. And when I look at the climate movement today, what I find disappointing is just how little public action took place. I saw a lot of sign-ons, I saw a lot of action alerts, but the number of cities in which public actions were taking place to support Build Back Better legislation, I mean, legislation that some people said would cut child poverty in half. I mean, to not have, large numbers of people in the climate movement in the street, to me, it just shows just that we're just not at a point yet to win climate legislation. And so to me, that's why I think the focus has to be organizing communities of faith to do public actions and to do more of them and do them consistently, because it's not going to be, one public action isn't going to pass a piece of legislation, and it's not going to happen in one election cycle. Getting the kind of change we need, it has to be sustained over a long period of time as a movement. And so that's kind of, for me, the naked truth that I've come to. But I think I'm interested in getting your thoughts on that. The other naked truth, though, that I've come to in trying to work with some of our regional jurisdictions in the United Church of Christ, where I'm currently working with people in Iowa and Florida on doing public actions and using what I call a learn by doing retreat, where we end by doing a public action in front of a congressperson's in-district office. That's where I feel like the action is needed. The action isn't needed in Washington, D.C. It's needed in people's districts. And so what I've encountered, though, like and just recently was, we can never do this because, we have too many conservatives in our church, or people, it's like, or it's just, we can't even get people to go out for doing this or that. And my feeling is, okay, like they're using that as a justification for not doing public action. And my thought is, well, does that mean that we are part of the problem in creating that we're creating insulation? We're insulating the people in power when we're just saying we can't take public action because it's going to be divisive within our faith communities. To me, that's just like, okay, that we're part of the problem. We are shielding and buffering those in power if we're going to let that stop us from taking public action. And so I don't know. That's kind of. But what do we then do? Like in that kind of context as faith communities. So those are some of what I see as naked truths, and I'm still wrestling with them. And I would love to kind of hear your thoughts. If maybe you see different naked truths, but I'm definitely curious to hear that.